PowerPoint.
All right. Okay, perfect. So then that means that we can get started. All right, everyone. Welcome to this installment of the UQ Philosophy Seminar. Thank you very much to everyone who is actually here in person and to the people online as well. Without you, we could not have any seminar at all. And of course, great thanks to our guest speaker today, Professor Daniel Nolan from Notre Dame, although I think that he's moving to a different affiliation soon. But at the moment, still Notre Dame. And Daniel is going to be talking to us about merely possible fictional characters. So please, Daniel, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Guillermo. And thanks so much for inviting me. It's lovely to even be virtually back in St. Lucia. So this talk's kind of about a niche topic. It's about, so there's already a puzzle about fictional characters. We talk as if there are these beings like Sherlock Holmes or Bilbo Baggins, and not just the people, but the mountains and the cities and so on. And they're stories. It's not true. It's not real. So there's already a puzzle about what we're doing when we talk about fictional characters, and we don't just do it in the course of telling a story. We do it when we compare fictional characters. We compare characters to real life. We make sort of literary criticism kind of involving the characters and their roles and what they stand for, and were they depicted elegantly. There's all sorts of discourse about that, and philosophers have traditionally had a range of different views about what's going on there and whether there are fictional characters, and in what does Sherlock Holmes have to do with being a detective, and how do we explain, if we do want to say that Sherlock Holmes is a detective, then how come he's so different from the flesh and blood ones we might meet? But if we don't want to say that, then how do we explain the apparent people going around talking like he is when they don't seem to be under any kind of factual misapprehension? But I'm interested in a little more esoteric question. So leave aside philosophical scruples about how we're going to eventually make sense of this, because I'll be back to those in a second. There are all these characters and all these stories we do tell, but it's very natural also to talk about the stories we don't tell. And so not just philosophers kind of interested in that, but again, there's a widespread practice outside philosophy talking about not just the stories that were told, but the ones that weren't, right? So a frustrated author might sort of lament that they never got to develop some idea they had, or some showrunner when their show's cancelled, And the stories that are never told, some of them would include or describe characters that don't turn up in any actual story, or at least don't turn up in any standard actual story. I'll come back to some edge cases. So there seem to be, so at least the way we talk, there are the stories we tell, the stories we don't tell, and the characters that are in the stories, the actual stories that are produced and shared, but also that's not the sort of limit. There are the characters that could have been made up or could have been talked about by authors, but never were. So my topic today is these merely possible fictional characters, in the sense of they are not characters of any story that's in fact told, but they would be characters of stories that could be told. So they're the characters that were never talked about. I should say one shortcut I'm taking is I'm going to, from time to time, mention examples just to make it a bit more vivid. But there's a kind of performative contradiction, if you like, about setting up an example of a character that nobody's ever talked about and then talking about them, right? Because that thereby might say enough about the character so that that's not a character that doesn't appear anymore because I fleshed it out. So one option, a boring, slow, confusing option, would be to never talk about particular examples and just use generalizations about these characters of stories that were never told. But I'm going to help myself occasionally to just sort of talking about some character and encourage you to join me in the pretense that even though I've kind of told you enough about the character so you know what I'm talking about, this character hasn't turned up in an actual story, even a little philosophical sketch. So I'll be talking. Yeah. Okay. So what do I want to say about these merely possible fictional characters? Two things. One is I want to say that we should take this talk seriously. We should think that there's a difference between the appropriate things to say and the inappropriate things to say about the characters of the stories that aren't the actual stories. And more ambitiously, I want to say that we should treat them roughly the same way as we treat the characters of the actual stories. So, but I don't want to tie myself to a particular story about that. So what I'm going to do is talk about some options that people find appealing for talking about actual fictional characters, and mix and match a bit, because often when we talk about things that could have happened but didn't, we take ourselves to be talking about, possibilia, merely possible objects. I'm an oldest child, but I could have had an older sister. She could have lived in Brisbane too. And so merely possible fictional characters, one natural thing to think is, well, whatever the relationship between real human beings and merely possible human beings is, maybe it's something like that between the characters of actual stories and the characters of merely possible stories. So I want to talk a little bit about options for understanding our talk about merely possible objects, because again, there's a lot of talk about merely possible objects outside philosophy, right? So events like vacations people didn't take or speeches they didn't give, objects like the artifacts they didn't create or the children they didn't have. However we understand that talk in a philosophical level, it goes on kind of outside the philosophy seminar room. And you might think the resources to find what to say about the merely possible fictional characters might be among the resources we use to talk about the merely possible in general. And I think it turns out there are lots of good options for mixing and matching theories about what's going on with apparent talk of mere possibilia and apparent talk of fictional characters, where talk of fictional characters for stories that haven't been told just drop out very naturally as understandable in the same terms. But I think there's one of the popular views about how to talk about fictional characters does get into trouble. So on one, maybe it's one of the front runners these days. One view about fictional characters is sometimes called creationism or creationist abstractionism, where fictional characters, they exist. There is such a thing as Sherlock Holmes. It's an abstract object, or he's an abstract object. But he's a funny kind of abstract object compared to, say, properties or sets or numbers. He was created. Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes into existence as a fictional character, and creationists disagree about what it would take to remove him from existence. Some think it's too late, he's in existence now. Others think if all the Sherlock Holmes stories disappeared and everybody forgot them, there would be no more character Sherlock Holmes. So these people think it's sort of contingent which fictional characters there are, and that we bring them into existence and maybe take them out of existence. I think so on the face of it, but also I think even on closer examination, if you're a creationist or creationist abstractionist about fictional characters, you'll think the characters of the stories that haven't been told and will never be told, they never get created, so they never come into existence, so they don't exist. So there's no such thing as a character of a merely possible story. Because Sherlock Holmes, he's real. I mean, albeit probably not exactly a detective, or not a detective in the same way that flesh and blood detectives typically are. But he wouldn't have been real. He came into existence because of the stories, and he wouldn't have been in existence if the stories hadn't been in existence. So the creationist seems to be drawing a line saying characters in actual stories, okay, good, they exist. We can count them and compare them. characters in merely possible stories, they could have been brought into existence, but they just weren't. So there are no such things. And I think, well, hopefully you'll agree with me that the creationist has to say fairly different things about, speaking loosely, these two classes of characters, the characters of the actual stories and the characters of the merely possible stories. So this, if I'm right that we should treat those two groups of characters in roughly the same way, many theories of fictional characters won't have any problem with that. It'll all be nice and smooth. It'll make sense. But the creationist will be in trouble. Now, I'm not saying that this is the worst problem creationism might face. One reason I got interested in this, partly it's just a kind of interesting case that I hadn't thought much about, even though I'd thought about Possibilia and also thought about Fictionalia. But there's a lot of, it feels like a pretty close to a standoff about fictional characters. There are a bunch of camps of people and they're pretty well entrenched and they don't change their mind very often. And this seemed like a new diagnostic tool. This is at least a new consideration, as far as I know, for seeing how these theories of fictional characters handle a problem case. And if all of them are in good shape except the creationists, I think that's some weight against the creationists, though. If I could see how somebody, if they were really committed to abstract creationism, they wouldn't be budged out of it. But, you know, the standard for an interesting philosophical argument presumably isn't you can dig out a philosopher if they're really committed to rejecting the conclusion. Right? That's rare. Okay, so a little more setup. One thing I should talk about is there is a risk that all possible characters have already been incorporated into actual fictions. There's a few ways this might have happened. So some actual fictions kind of talk about other fictions and seem to say that all the fictional characters are somehow in the story or accessible from the story. So one oldish example is Robert Heinlein's Number of the Beast. They find this dimension hopping machine and it looks like it can travel to the dimensions of stories, and they speculate that every story's kind of world is out there somewhere along these dimensions. On one reading of that, yeah, every character in every story is in the world of Number of the Beast because they're all out in one of those dimensions. And there's various other cases where stories seem to try to incorporate other stories. So Borges's Library of Babel has every book in it, and at least a slight tweak on that, sort of all the characters in all the books could be sort of, you could say something, you could have some generalizations about those, and that might cover every possible character. A different kind of case, so Nathan Wildman and, is it Nathaniel Fold, they've recently purported to have produced a kind of maximal fiction or a trivial fiction according to which every proposition is true. Every proposition whatsoever is true according to the little story that they claim to have set up. If they did that successfully, presumably what's true according to that story is enough to describe every possible character many, many times over, and probably in many, many conflicting ways. I don't quite know what the connection between truth in stories and characters is, but it looks like if it's true according to the story, a whole bunch of stuff about some particular character, then maybe that character counts as being in that story somehow. So if it turns out that every possible fictional character is already in an actual story, that seems like a bit of a accident of how metafictional genres and things like that have gone. So this talk might have to be about a more fictionally impoverished world where we've told stories like, you know, Alice in Wonderland and War and Peace and so on, but we haven't told these fiction spanning stories, or we haven't told these universal fictions. And kind of what maybe at more impoverished worlds like that, they can draw a distinction between the characters of the stories that have in fact been told in their world and the characters in stories that have not yet been told in their world. But I'm going to keep the more common sense assumption that we haven't already captured every possible fictional character in the stories we tell. Now, I've been helping myself to a lot of language that you might be suspicious of, stories that haven't been told, characters that only appear in those stories. One of the options I'll be getting to is the option where that's a mistake and there are no such stories and there are no such characters. So I've been talking the way I take it lots of people outside philosophy do talk, and I do think that it should be our job to find something that's acceptable, the boundary between the acceptable and the non-acceptable when we generalize like that. Just like, even if you don't think there are any fictional characters, saying Sherlock Holmes was a detective, there's something correct about that saying Sherlock Holmes was a race car driver is less correct, or certainly less correct when the stories of Conan Doyle are kind of the focus of the conversation. Whatever the right way of going on with fictional character discourse versus the wrong way of going on about fictional character discourse, that's sort of what's at stake, even if you think that discourse is defective or false or doesn't wear its form on its sleeve or anything like that. Okay, so it might be helpful for me to just go through what I take to be some of the main options about how to think about fictional characters. And as you'll notice, they're fairly similar to the main menu of options for how to think about merely possible objects in general. So merely possible tables and chairs, and merely possible people, and merely possible songs, and merely possible whatever. So surprisingly to me when I first came across this, and surprisingly often when I tell non-philosophers this, a lot of philosophers these days think fictional characters exist. They think Sherlock Holmes exists. They think the dragons from Tolkien's work exist. But most of them who think that these characters really do, in fact, exist, think that they're abstract objects of some sort. So the big split here is between the so-called Platonist abstractionists and the so-called creationist abstractionists. So the Platonist abstractionists think that fictional characters are abstract objects, but think that these abstract objects exist independent of the actions of storytellers and story creators. So maybe they're a sui generis kind of abstract object, and some of them get linked up to actual storytelling episodes or actual story continuation episodes, and some of them don't. Or fairly commonly, if you're a Platonist abstractionist, you might want to identify or analyze fictional characters in terms of some other kind of abstract objects you already believe in. So you might think a fictional character is a set of properties, or maybe a function from stages of a story to sets of properties, if you think characters kind of develop or have different features at different points in the story or across stories. Or maybe they're, so several people have been exploring the option that they're sort of, they're roles in Pavel Tiki's sense. So the sense of the Australian Prime Minister, where it doesn't look like it just means Albo, but the Australian Prime Minister in 1973 was Gough, and now it's Albo. One thing you might think there's this role or this office, Australian Prime Minister, and that it's occupied sometimes by Gough, sometimes by Albo. Maybe Sherlock Holmes is like a detective role that's never in fact occupied, but is kind of available there to be employed in stories or something. Just like you could have a story about an Australian Prime Minister that didn't correspond to any actual politician or even actual person. So for the Platonists, they tend to think the familiar characters, the characters in the stories that we're familiar with and know and love, those are a subset of the kind of thing that's out there available to be the characters. Now, you might want to only call them characters once they turn up in stories. It's kind of verbal, I guess. But there are, just like, say, if Sherlock Holmes is a set of properties, there's also sets of properties that include being a detective and include taking cocaine, but have a whole bunch of different properties that Sherlock Holmes than the ones that are attributed to Sherlock Holmes. And those sets are out there. We haven't deployed most of those in our storytelling yet, or so I'll suppose, but they exist just as much as Sherlock Holmes does. So the creationist I mentioned before, again, Sherlock Holmes stands in some unusual relationship to properties like being a detective or smoking a pipe, the kind of relationship that an abstract object can. But for the creationist, that abstract object that's somehow associated with being a detective and has various of the other features that Conan Doyle in the story says Sherlock Holmes has, Conan Doyle created it. It's it turns up in other fictions. Obviously, creationists might disagree amongst themselves about, say, the identity conditions of these things. When have I got a new character and when have I reused an old one? When to pick characters out of two stories, are they the same character or not? How do you know, there's all kinds of questions that creationists could disagree on. But they have, and for my purposes, one thing that's interesting about them is it looks like they say that you need some actual activity. Now they also disagree about that. So some of them might think a character has to make it all the way into a produced story to count as having been brought into existence. Others might think the musings of authors are enough to generate a bunch of characters. So sometimes authors will talk about choosing which character to put in some episode. You could be a creationist who says, yes, they thought of these characters and that was enough to make them real, and now they're going to pick one and tell you a story about them. Others might think, no, that's just preparatory, right? They're kind of like the workman, like the painter laying out the paints. We haven't got the painting yet. The painting will only happen when it goes up on the canvas. Again, for my purposes, I don't mind too much which of those things creationists say. Then there are some minor options, like an almost empty view is the view that fictional characters are concrete flesh and, or the people, for example, that are fictional characters are concrete flesh and blood like you and me. David Lewis kind of has a view a bit like this because apparent talk about Sherlock Holmes seems to be, at least on one view of what he's doing, talk that picks up merely possible detectives that meet the kind of standards, meet the kind of criteria from the stories. There are other weirder views that might be like this, or even weirder by my standards anyway. So Nelson Goodman has an approach to world versions where he says different and sometimes conflicting world versions can all be real, can all be actual. So the world of common sense and the world of science, maybe they don't even match, but they're both actual and both full of things, right? The world of science really does have molecules and weather patterns and things like that in it, and the world of common sense really does have tables and chairs and people and artworks. He's explicit that he doesn't want to do this for stories, but you could imagine a Goodmanian about stories who thinks that the King Arthur stories or the Robin Hood stories or the Marvel Extended Universe kind of all are world versions too. Maybe they're world versions that are kind of not. We don't interact with them like we interact with the world version that physics gives us or the world version that common sense gives us. But, world versions are all different. So you could be a kind of Goodmanian who thinks, yeah, look, King Arthur's riding around in fancy armor on big, heavy war horses just as much as Henry VIII did. It's just different world versions of Arthur and Henry VIII. This is a view so weird, I'm not even sure any philosopher has held it, but, you can see how it might go. More common and maybe more reasonable is a sort of Meinongian approach to fictional characters, where fictional characters may even have a lot of the features they seem to. It's just that they don't exist. A kind of straightforward Meinongianism, sort I think probably Routley had. King Arthur yeah, he does. He's a good rider. He's a sword wielder. He does command armies. It's just that he doesn't exist, and maybe his armies doesn't exist, and maybe his horses don't exist. More complicated Meinongians, like Graham Priest or Franz Berto, they'll say things like, "Oh well, okay, these characters don't have these features at the actual world, but they have these features at some other possible world, and they don't exist." So, in King Arthur's world, he's a king and so on, but he doesn't exist, and maybe his world doesn't exist either. That Right, that certainly avoids the weirdness of saying Sherlock Holmes exists. At least the straightforward Meinongian can say a lot of things that other people on my list so far can't say, like Sherlock Holmes. He might be a detective in just the same sense as any actual real existing person has ever been a detective. It's just that he lacked existence, which is why we don't sort of come across artifacts associated with him as often as you might think. The final cluster of views, which I think I probably have the most sympathy for, though I lapse into things like Platonist abstractionism, is some kind of nominalism or so-called fictionalism where there aren't any fictional characters. There's no such thing as Sherlock Holmes. It's a story. It's not true. If it were true, there probably would have to be a detective running around London doing deduction in very strange ways that surprisingly work out a lot. But it's not. And there isn't a guy like that. And there wasn't. Fictionalisms come to be used for a view like this. So, say, Stuart Brock famously defends where you explain why it's okay to say a bunch of things even though they're not true. And you've got various options here. But the idea is there's something appropriate or acceptable about saying Sherlock Holmes is a detective, or even counting the detectives in fiction of the era or something like that, talking as if there's such things when there isn't. I think kind of tempting. There's various ways of spelling it out. If you're a fictionalist or a nominalist, notice it's pretty easy to take the same attitude to the characters of merely possible fictions, right? If there's no Sherlock Holmes, there's probably no alternate detectives either. In fact, I didn't say this at the time, but Meinongians are also usually pretty happy to have untold stories and non-existent characters associated with the untold stories too, right? Like, why not, right? So you've already got all sorts of things that don't exist. Surely the stories that aren't in existence would be in non-existence, right? That they don't exist too. And the characters that maybe would exist if if the stories were true, they don't exist either, right? So the Meinongian can treat the merely possible fictional characters in just the same way as they treat the fictional characters, if they wish. Okay, so maybe the characters of the stories that haven't been told but could have been, as I'm putting it, the merely possible stories, maybe we should treat them like we treat merely possible objects. And we've got a similar but not quite the same list of options here. I think the most common view about merely possible objects is that they do exist, there are such things, but they're abstract and they bear some kind of indirect relationship to the properties that we talk about them having. So there could have been blue swans, even though there aren't. That means there are these abstract objects, possible blue swans. Well, means. It turns out it's true that, according to this theory, that there are abstract objects associated with the properties of being swan and associated with being the property of blue. You don't run into them at your local pond. Maybe they don't have any location in space and time, though they would have if they'd existed. Yeah, real abstract. Creationist abstractionism, I think, is a kind of currently unoccupied position about merely possible objects. I think it's really tempting to think that there's more things that are possible than the things that we happen to have thought about or specified. There's nothing stopping you being a creationist abstractionist about mere possibilities that I can see, apart from how tempting that view would be. But in fact, pretty much all the abstractionists I can think of tend to be on more the Platonist side, that it doesn't take human beings or our intervention or whatever to make, just like it's not up to us what's possible, it's not up to us which merely possible objects there are. Right? If something's possible, if there's a possibility that there's a certain kind of object, then there's a possible object that is that way, or is associated with that way, or something like that. Yeah. Infamously, some people think mere possibilities are concrete, flesh and blood, just as much as this one is, David Lewis, but also people who think that we're just in one position of the quantum mechanical wave function, and in other positions there are a completely different group of people occupying the various spots we're in, doing something different. Again, you could be a Meinongian about mere possibilities, right? Possible blue swans. But if you wanted, they could be blue swans. It's just that they don't exist. Or if you like, they could stand in some more indirect relationship to the properties of being blue and being a swan, like being a blue swan at some possible world, not this one. Again, popular view, probably more popular among non-philosophers than philosophers, is to say there's no such thing as a merely possible object, right? If it's supposedly an object, but it turns out it's only possible and it's not actual, and there's no such thing. You could still talk apparently about possible objects and what's acceptable to say about them, what's unacceptable to say about them in some kind of fictionalist way or through some paraphrase or something like that. Now, again, with all of these options, I mean, some of them it's going to be a little bit difficult. So some of these mixes and matches won't be very appealing. Like if you think merely possible objects are all concrete, but you think fictional characters are abstract, then merely possible fictional characters might not be like that. Even though that concretist option might include contingent abstract objects. If there are such things, then maybe they're kind of out in Lewis's other worlds just as much as contingent abstract objects are in ours. So you could kind of tweak some of these combinations to make sense, even if they didn't make sense as I stated them. And a bunch of these will play very nicely with treating, if we did want to treat merely possible stories as abstract objects and the contents of them being abstract objects, then we could say they all exist, like the Platonist abstractionist about fictional characters does. If you're a Meinongian about mere possibilities and merely possible stories, then you might well want to be a Meinongian about merely possible, the merely possible characters of those merely possible stories. Like maybe there are some Meinongians who are very strict about which non-existent objects there are, but the tendency tends to be once you've opened the gates to the non-existent, then you may as well let in. As long as it doesn't exist, that might be about good enough for it to be a non-existent object. Maybe you want some constraints for paradox reasons or something, but why not be generous about the things that don't exist? Okay, so yeah, lots of these options you can mix and match. As somebody pointed out to me, if you're a concretist about mere possible objects, then it might make it easier to be an abstractionist, a creationist abstractionist, because then you could say the characters of the merely possible stories don't exist in our world, but it's okay, they're out there in modal space being created by other authors. But for a lot of these options, if you're a creationist abstractionist, I would guess the best you could do is to say that a merely possible fictional character isn't a fictional character, but it somehow it's an abstract object that stands in some relationship to the kinds of features that actual fictional characters, abstract fictional characters have. Yeah, maybe that's the best option they have on board. I'll come back to what the best option might be. How am I doing? Okay, so why treat merely possible fictional characters in the same way as actual fictional characters? I'm hoping that it seems off the cuff appealing. It's always dangerous to assume audiences are going to share your sympathies, but here's some things to say. The talk about them looks fairly similar. Once you start noticing that there are stories that can't be told and that they have characters, then talking about the characters of the stories that don't turn up in the actually told stories seems as natural as talking about the fictional characters in the first place. They all of them lack the kind of full-blooded reality that some black swans have, or maybe all black swans have. You know, the ones you actually see around Australia. The one reason why I want to distinguish my merely possible older sister from my actual siblings is, you know, she's not around when I go home, and you know, she's very different from real flesh and blood people, but merely possible fictional characters don't seem as different from the characters of the actual stories, right? We have these reasons for talking about them. We have these reasons for comparing them and going on about them, but they all lack this kind of full-blooded reality. So I don't think we're under pressure to distinguish them in as sharp a way as we want to distinguish merely possible people from actual people. I guess I think there is some appeal to treating like cases alike. And as far as I can tell, the sort of motives for even taking talk about merely possible fictional characters seriously look pretty similar to the motives for taking talk about fictional characters seriously in the first place. Again, it depends a little bit on, well, either the strength of the arguments or your philosophical tastes, whether you want to go abstractionist about them all or Meinongian about them all or somehow fictionalist or paraphrase theorist about them all. But, you know, a general theoretical desideratum seems to be to treat like cases alike. And, well, these strike me as alike, and I hope they strike you as alike. One thing I notice when I'm thinking about merely possible fictional characters and I try to talk about them is I really do slip into the way of thinking that they're all out there and we just select some, right? So which fictional characters ended up making it into the actual stories? It feels like some of them did and some of them didn't. That natural way of talking makes it kind of look relational. It looks like the difference between a world in which Sherlock Holmes gets stories told about him and instead a world where Murloc houses the underwater detective that watches fish movements all the time. The big difference looks relational. It looks like, what did Conan Doyle do with his words and his texts and his pieces of paper and ink? It doesn't look like a kind of intrinsic difference between Sherlock Holmes and Murloc. Now, that's not supposed to mean that it's incoherent to think that there's an important intrinsic difference or even that one exists and the other one doesn't. But it does. I report that it feels natural to slip into this selection talk when thinking about the contrast. And for what that's worth, that kind of suggests to me that selection talk looks like it must somehow be okay. One minor benefit for believing in the merely possible fictional characters as well, the actual fictional characters, is it gives us an appealing story about the vagueness of which fictional characters got created or got actual stories told about them. So there's a kind of continuum from a few scraps of film being shot and a few scrappy drafts being produced all the way up to a nice finished fiction. Or even further back from the daydreaming of a potential author to all the way up to the launch party. It would be kind of nice if cases where it's indeterminate, some fictional character got created, there's just a range of potential things that could have been selected from. Maybe I can talk more about that in question time because it's hard to generalize across these views about exactly how this selection from a range thing would do. But let me at least give an analogy, right? So we want the word bald to be vague. What's nice is we've got a whole bunch of hair distributions, and it's kind of unsettled where the line between all of those got drawn. as to what the bald boundary line was. If we didn't have a whole bunch of hair distributions and we just had to kind of have some hair distribution that was indeterminately bald, that wouldn't be as appealing a picture of what the underlying thing going on that gave rise to the vagueness of a boundary. Likewise, it would be nice if there was a whole bunch of fictional characters or a whole bunch of standards for a fictional character to have turned up in a story, and the fictional character be somehow there, able to be talked about whether or not it ended up in the story. Maybe that's partly a motive for sort of Platonist abstractionism as much as it's a motive for treating merely possible fictional characters the same way as actual fictional characters. But again, I can talk about that more. So the last thing I want to do is, okay, well, if you suppose you are an abstract creationist and you don't want to say that there are any characters of any merely possible stories. So you want to say you need a story for there to be a character, or a proto-story, but I'll just say story. No story, no character. So the characters of the merely possible stories, those there's no such thing. So the first thing you can do is say, look, there's big differences between Sherlock Holmes and Murloc houses. The Holmes stories have had all kinds of effects on our culture, all kinds of effects on the entertainment business, all kinds of effects about how people think about detectives and why so many people even have the concept of a private consulting detective, which is a slightly odd way to arrange the investigation of criminal matters. Sherlock's kind of embedded in our reality in all kinds of ways in which Murloc just isn't. And I think that's right, but I don't think it directly motivates treating Sherlock and Murloc differently as far as they themselves go, right? Because it's going to be common ground. Everybody's going to think that the world is very different Sherlock Holmes-wise than it would have been if Conan Doyle hadn't written those stories, right? Everybody kind of accepts that there are all these pen and ink things on shelves and rolls of film, or I guess these days, just computer programs that get shown in cinemas and so on, right? Those differences between Sherlock and Murloc look largely extrinsic. They look largely differences about things that aren't Sherlock Holmes or Murloc houses. So the Sherlock Holmes aspect of reality is kind of big and rich and complex and interesting in all kinds of ways, but it doesn't look, I mean, even if you believe in Sherlock Holmes, a lot of that reality is not Sherlock Holmesy, right? It's people thinking things and saying things and spending their money and so on. So I do think there's a big difference between Sherlock and Murloc, but it doesn't look intrinsic. It doesn't look like it's about them so much as about the relational stuff. The other thing a creationist can point to is some of the substantive claims we make about fictional characters, or so-called critical claims, do seem to presuppose that only actual fictional characters exist. Like somebody who says that Sherlock Holmes is the most intelligent detective in fiction, or that the Hulk is the strongest superhero, they're presumably not contrasting them with all of the characters that didn't turn up in any actual story, right? They're not making the claim that you couldn't write a story where there was a character smarter than Sherlock Holmes, or that there's no possible superhero story where some character's stronger than the Hulk. It looks like it's got to be constrained to the characters of actual stories. And so you might think, well, that's evidence that we take only the characters of actual stories to be the ones in existence. They're the only ones to compare Hulk to when Hulk is the strongest. If he is. I made the mistake of looking today online, and there's endless silly arguments about which superhero is the strongest. So okay, so what do I want to say about that? So that's definitely right. And some of the things we say would be false if we were also generalizing about all the characters of stories that hadn't been told as well. false or inappropriate. If it's not truth that's at stake, something else is at stake. I guess I think everybody should be tempted to some extent to think some of the things we say are only true because of quantifier restriction. Like the people who talk about the most intelligent detective in fiction, they often neglect all the future characters as well, right? So now maybe some of them do because they have a metaphysics where there's no future and no story is ever told later than now. But a lot of them, I think, are just leaving out the future, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the characters until now, or I'm talking about maybe the characters in. They also tend to neglect any characters that might have turned up in any fictions, kind of not done by humans or not done on Earth. Right? It's a big universe out there. I'd be actually surprised if there were no other storytellers out there anywhere. But we tend to ignore that when we're doing literary criticism. We don't have to. I mean, literary criticism is a relatively untouched academic field, but we ignore that when we're arguing about who the smartest detective is or who the strongest superhero is. So, given that we're already doing quite a bit of domain restriction, either explicitly or implicitly, I think the people who believe in more fictional characters than you might have expected just have to say that we often leave them out when we're doing our comparisons or our superlatives. There's obviously a debate to be had whenever somebody believes in more things than you might have expected and then says, yeah, a lot of the time we're not talking about those. It can be a suspicious move sometimes, at least in the leaving out extraterrestrial stories and leaving out future stories. It doesn't look particularly suspicious to me. So maybe I'm trying to stick leaving out the untold stories in this good company. But I think were I to be a creationist, the substantive critical generalizations is probably where I would try to hang my hat. And I think that's potentially the strongest place to push back on this, treating the characters of merely possible fictions the same as the characters of actual fictions. But my sense of which things are the most scary often doesn't match the audience's, so I'd be very interested, among other things, to hear about if I should be more cautious about thinking that we should treat these the same. And if we should treat these the same, whether that's bad news for the abstract creationist. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Great.